This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. We will also explore threats to meaningful engagement in sport and movement culture practices and ask questions about what we can learn about the human condition through our involvement in sport. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. I am very excited about today's episode, where we are learning about sport in ancient Greece. What would be the key differences between sport back then compared to sport as we know it today? What was the cultural significance of sport? And how can we imagine athletes approach their sport? And what was the purpose of sport? I am delighted to introduce our guest, who has a very interesting background. He is a former athlete in Nordic combined, which is the combination of ski jumping and cross-country skiing. After finishing his athletic career, he transitioned to coaching in his sport, and currently he is the head coach of the Finnish national team. However, why he is here with me today is not because of his job, but because he has recently published a novel which tells the story of Alekos, a wrestler who grew up in Athens during the time of Plato and Aristotle and trained to compete in the Olympic Games. This fascinating book has 750 pages, and it provides a glimpse to the life and sport in a very different world, also helping us to reflect on our lives and our sports today. Today, we will hear more about that world, as well as about the equally fascinating story behind this book. Welcome, Kukkonen, and thank you so much for joining me for today's exciting discussion.
Thank you. It's good to be here and discussing this topic with you.
I think it's such a fascinating story behind your book that it's something that you've been working on over the years while you have had a full-time job as a professional coach. And writing something that is over 700 pages, it really requires massive time and investment as well. So maybe you can start telling a little bit about how the idea for the book came about and how you actually did it.
That's actually a really long story. I checked yesterday my files, and the first one was written in 2007, and I think that I even started before that. What comes to this book, and I think all started after my sport career. There's lots of changes in me and my thinking. When we athletes, we are kind of living in a bubble, and I would see I was a little bit narrow-minded, and but I don't know why it happened that I wanted to look deeper in the world and human being and so forth. But somehow I started to read lots about history, some ancient civilizations, religions, and that kind of stuff. And at the same time, I loved writing. I started short, blog text or that kind of things, and then these two things combined. I found very nice story in Greece about the Olympic Games, and I was also not satisfied what happened in ski jumping and Nordic combined field. And at that time, we were really successful, but at the same time, we lost the touch in the field. We didn't recruit juniors, and we lost the clubs and that kind of things. And so I kind of decided to. First, my idea was somehow combine this time and then the ancient history, so it would have been story in two different layers. But then again, when I start writing and searching for more information, then I realized that it's better to put the whole story in ancient Greece. Yeah, it all started like 15 years ago. Let's put it this way. And I was more writing in springtime, and I convinced myself that I can only write in springtime because it takes lots of time in the training camps and competition season, and I didn't have energy. That's what I thought. But then later, when I realized that the book is not going actually forward as fast as I wanted. So at one point I made the decision that now I will finalize the book, because I never want to like leave the things undone. And I decided also to write during the training camps. So every possible moment, let's say after the lunch break, when I was done finished my work, I opened the laptop and I did 1 hour work. And then in the evening time, when camp day was over, I could easily write. Let's say I started at 9 or 10 in the evening, and I wrote like 3 to 4 hours to finish the book. And yeah, then at one point I really finished it, and then I think that I thought that it's done now. But then there's like one media, I think it was Ilta-Sanomat, who made a story about me as a coach and so forth, and then I say that I have this kind of hobby, and because of this article, one guy who is researching history and like author himself, he contacted me via email and asked, can he read the book and help and like see if it's worth publishing, and they said, of course you can help me, and I sent all these documents to him, and then that kind of like started a totally new level of the book, and he said that in one day this book could be published, but you need to do some work to make like the plot tighter and take some stuff out. And so it is a long story, and now we'll finally hear when it's ready, and yeah, I'm really satisfied with that one.
Yeah, well, that's very exciting. It's like a 15 years of work, and now coming to completion, and the book has been published. And unfortunately for our listeners, it's in Finnish, but at least you will hear about the idea and a little bit about what's going on in the book and about sport in ancient world. Yeah, I'd love to go back a little bit to what you said at the start, that you were saying that as an athlete yourself, you were maybe a little bit narrow-minded. And then kind of when you stopped competing yourself, when you retired from sport, that was a somewhat turning point in your life, and how you started maybe expanding, reading history, learning new things. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that time in your life. It sounds like it was a transformative time.
Yeah, I think that's what happened for most of the athletes. The better you are, the bigger problems you face after your sport career. I think it's the bubble or narrow-minded thing comes from that aspect, because the athletes, the body is their only instrument, and it has to work all the time. It's like the voice for Luciano Pavarotti. He cannot. I was sort of reading his book, and I was like amazed how much he's thinking his voice and not losing it. How he like wears when he goes outside, and what he eats and that kind of thing. So it's same for the sports, that you have to really focus in all things around you, that how you protect your only instrument, and that may lead to that point that people think outside of you or around you that these guys, they only have one thing in their mind, and it's sports. So that's the thing. And when the transition comes, kind of like emptiness hits you, at what's the next step? Should I don't know, study or do work or the different kind of things. But the most important thing is that you start doing something, and you use so much energy on top sport. So what I mean is, when your sport career is done, you have invested all your energy and time to top sport, and then the emptiness hits you. Then you really need to find something to do, studying or working, or like just like something. And for me, it was first studying, and then I started like reading, and I had like a couple of good friends who was into reading at that time, and they suggested me a few really good books, and then I get more into reading and history and ancient times, and then little by little I realized that how the world may work and what's the role of human being. Of course, we don't have any like final answers or anything like that, but still you're quite amazed how your thinking start changing and understanding and that kind of things, how they grow inside of you.
Again, hearing the story, it's wonderful to hear about that kind of journey and how it all comes to writing this wonderful book. And so, I mean, you also had a job. You started coaching athletes, and it's not like you had nothing to do, but at the same time you were exploring this ancient world and reading history and trying to understand what life was back then for those people. So maybe you can tell a little bit about why was it ancient Greece that you got kind of most interested in, and what was in that world that was exciting and that was drawing you to learn more about that?
Yeah, ancient Greece. Maybe it was just like a matter of luck. So you can find these interesting stories in old civilizations. But I think it was because of the sport still. I found like such a nice frame for my story. And I also wanted to dive into different differences to different sport world. And the deeper I got, then I kind of like first realized that or the differences. Then finally I understood that they're actually very similar. So I find it very similar how they are, how they work. Because they had like 1,000 years long Olympic Games tradition. It started 776 BC or even earlier, and it lasted until the times of Rome, until it was like the games were, I don't know, how do you call it, like cancelled, or because Zeus was not anymore respected as god in Rome, so that was a thing. It ended. But I think people are always so fascinated about this very moment that we are living, and we despise about the past, or even like pity how we people could have lived in such conditions without luxury we had, and like searching that kind of things, and like suddenly found out that we have actually always tried our best, and they had like really high culture with tradition of democracy and theater and even philosophy, and like many interesting things that started like popping up when I did my research. So I think that was like the final thing. So sport was definitely the best theme or thing in the beginning, but then all these other things started to sum it up, my idea, and then I realized that that's the right place for my story.
Mm-hmm. I think now it's a wonderful time to give a little flavor of the story. So what's kind of the storyline of your book, and I don't want you to tell the whole plot and what happens there, but maybe just a little bit about the idea and the general story of the book.
It is a story about a wrestler named Alekos, and Alekos lived in Athens, and he prepares himself to Olympic Games in 364 BC. Still, the story begins when he was born in 386 BC. So it starts from his childhood, how he goes to school and plays with kids. It's the same block, and then he also has a stepbrother called Dionysius. So basically, it's their story, how these two young kids grow, like listening the old stories about heroes who were fighting or competing in the Olympic Games, and what kind of, not the results, but what kind of acts, like crazy acts they did, and that's the starting point. And I would say that the main theme is around the sports. But then it's the other part of the book it's about how the society worked, how was their beliefs, their religions, how's the politics, power relationship between the city-states. Alex also met Plato, Aristotle, and that kind of things. He visited the king's court in Persia. He went to army for 2 years, waged war for democratic principles. So it's not just sports. I would say it's like 50-50. That's the basic idea of the book.
Yeah, and of course, to understand kind of the cultural significance of sport, you would also need to understand what else is going on in the society in terms of power relations, and you, having read like a few chapters at the beginning, you are doing such a very thick description of the family, how how the husband and wife relate to one another, what happens at school, what kind of equipment they have when they are studying, and all these things. So there must have been like a massive background research that you have done to kind of find out about all these details in life back then. So maybe you can share a bit about that background work and what kind of sources did you find for telling this story?
Yeah, sure. It was, of course, it was like huge job, but I also had lots of time. When you're writing for 15 years, then you have pretty much time to look for all the details. And I think that's also a little bit the challenge of the book, that I have tried to put too many things inside. That's my own challenge. I tried to like solve all the problems in the world in one book, but obviously it was not working. But anyway, that's another story. So, but I use like, of course, I loaned lots of books from the library. I read old stuff in internet in English language, like Pausanias, Plutarchus, Herodotus, Xenophon, and that kind of historians who lived before or right after a period of time when Alekos was there. So it's kind of like demanding job first to read it in English, trying to understand what happened, because that text is not the easiest one. And then you translate it in Finnish and try to figure it out how you put it inside your story. Then Wikipedia is one good source, and especially in those cases when all the data needs to be double checked. So if I found something, I need to check it in Wikipedia or in some of these books, and that's basically thing that I did. And just like when the years go by, I read a couple of few books, and then I realized, okay, I need this and that information, and that's how it grew and became that huge.
Yeah, and you say that towards the end of the process, you also had this historian who was helping you to put it together for the final publication. So how did he help you to find more information, or did he think that you already got like a fairly good and comprehensive picture, or did he find some errors in your in what you had written?
Yeah, luckily not that many errors. But I think we made it more like, I don't know if the deeper is the right word to describe it. But first we made the big picture look good. We made it tighter, like I said before, and tried to make the plot more clear, more understandable. But then in the second phase, we really focused on like words that some of the words didn't or that they couldn't use because they have like Latin background, so like many of the words, and then we changed, like we tried to find like the best describing words for like many sentences, and so it was like a very accurate work in the second round when we was writing. So we decided to do it as publisher would have done it. Yeah, of course, because he has been researching for years and years. He had like very good hints to, I cannot name like any, but still like he had lots of help.
Yeah. Let's move to your main character. Let's go into his head for a little bit. So what does he think about life, and what are his goals, and why is he attracted to sport the way he is?
At the beginning he was just like one regular guy living in Athens. His father was Panos, who was a ship supplier, and mother Erika, and she worked as a wool weaver. They had like a relatively poor family. Then Alekos, he always like wanted to ask why. He wants to travel, he wants to find answers, but why this kind of light started to burn in his head, I can't really answer that one. So some of the people, we just somehow find this burden to our shoulder, and Alekos was one of them to carry on these big questions on his shoulder. And he wanted to figure out how the world around us work. What's the purpose of human being? I think he's like a bit naive and a bit simple guy, like author himself. But just like when you keep your eyes and ears open and asking all the time questions, then you will at least know it better. And that's the basic like idea of Alekos' character.
What do we know more broadly about these athletes who went to the Olympics? Is Alekos like a typical athlete who would train for the Olympics, or is he from a different family or a different socioeconomic background than the typical athlete would be, or do we know about that?
Yeah, I would say that he was like typical. In some point, when you go to school, they start also learning sports. First in general level, they do all kind of sport, like all kind of disciplines in athletics. They even have some kind of games, which you could say they're very close to rugby or even ice hockey. They played in the fields, and then when they at the same time yeah.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very very interesting. And at some point, of course, they hear these stories because top athletes, they were not like say top athletes. They were just basically athletes. They didn't have these kind of things like we have this top athlete, and then we have different layers for athletes and physical activity and so forth. So, but they heard a story about the heroes, and in some point, the young kids, they just get interested. They want to be like their heroes. It's normal, or we know, or it's like very common also in nowadays. And Alekos got interested in wrestling. There was like one guy, Milo of Croton. He won 6 times in Olympic Games. One time when he was in the kids series, which means kids under 18 years old, and then he won 5 times in men's or adults. How do you want to call it? And that's why he was a legend who lived like 150 years ago. So that's like the basic background, and yeah, sport was involved in everyday life in many ways. Of course, it was like part of growing and educating kids to army, and that's been a tool for years and years, or for 1,000 years, to like combine these two things. So at the same time, when you get sport education, you prepared yourself for army and for the wars, which was still the main thing for ancient city-states.
Yeah. And what would you say in terms of, I mean, at some times sport has been kind of the middle class or upper class activity, and then in some other times it has been, and also in different cultures, it has been kind of the way to rise up from poverty, and it still is in certain parts of the world today. So, I mean, in terms of was sport something that was valued in the society and also valued in the more better off families, or how was that?
Yeah, we have to remember that in Athens, slaves did all this hard work, and kind of ideal of normal Athenian men was not to work, just hang around, do some philosophy, do some sports, and then think these big questions: what's the purpose of the world, and so forth.
Yeah.
But sport, I would say, it was combining effect of society, like when people went to gymnasiums, where that's the base for sports, for philosophy and war. There was also spa. So when rich and poor men met in those gymnasiums, they were like competing or doing sports naked. And then went to spa, they were like equal. It was like equality for them. And yeah, that's maybe one thing. Like so, but then other words, what was the meaning of sports for society? I think that the athletes were like really big stars as they are nowadays. It's like interesting how they, when they went to these big competitions, they had starting money, as it's also in our times. Then they had like very big, how do you call it, prizes, or
like prize money for
prize money. And when they won Olympic Games, they had like, at least in Athens, free accommodation, free food. There were like statues for them, and like that kind of advantages.
So it has been highly professional activity at that time.
Yeah, for sure. And they had coaches in different areas of this physical, or let's say that there could be one coach for weightlifting or getting your muscles bigger or growing your muscles, and one was for technique. And then the slaves in those gymnasiums, they could have some hints for your nutrition, not to use maybe wine, or you couldn't touch woman for a couple of months before Olympic Games, that you didn't lose your powers and so forth. The slaves, they did massage, and so like basically in all matter same kind of aspects than we have now in our top sport.
Yeah, that's really remarkable when you say about the specialization, that you would have like nowadays you would have a strength and conditioning coach, so they would also have that. What about the Olympic Games? I mean, in our time, they are like a massive spectacle and a real mega event. How was it back in the time of Alekos? What was the event like, and would everybody know that the Olympics is on?
Yeah, for sure. I would say that somehow it was at least as big as Olympic Games is today. Of course, competed in every 4 years, and the origin of the games was like a religional base for to have the Olympic Games for respecting the Zeus, the mighty power of, or the biggest power of the gods in Greece world. And they say that the Olympic Games were about wine and politics. So people traveled, like tens of thousands of people traveled to Olympia, where the Olympic Games were held every 4th year. So it was same location every year, or every 4th year. So the tens of thousands of people were there. Then they were, having some wine, having good discussions, lots of arguments about politics and previous wars or the power relationship in city-states. And then there was also sport competitions. And so,
but what you're saying, that it's not only about sport, that it's much more like a broader cultural event. And it strikes me that Olympics in our time, they try to be kind of non-political, so that they would have nothing to do with like broader societal issues, even if we of course know that that's not the case. But in ancient Greece, they would explicitly engage with politics, and the point of Olympics is to go and discuss politics. So that's quite fascinating as well.
Yeah, that was like probably the best place to really to see the people from different city-states and to really talk about the things.
Yeah. How about our main character? Does he have some political opinions? And you already mentioned a little bit that he's a bit of a philosopher as well. So what are his thoughts? His philosophical thoughts and his view on life?
I would say it's like I've said a couple of times, that he wanted to understand the world and human being. So he had lots of things between the lines, but because he's a bit naive and simple guy, he doesn't want to like say everything that clear, that I really think that we should do this and that. I think he wanted to understand the world so that there's room for all kind of opinions. There's room for slaves, there's room for ladies, and the more we are aware of the world, and the more we make our own research, the more we have like understanding and more humanity and tolerance between differences of like humans and all these differences that we found in the world. So I think that's also the main message of the book.
I mean, from the first chapters that I read, that our main character already as a child is questioning whether the slaves should be treated in the way that they are, as things and kind of almost like machines to be used to do your work. And from the first few chapters, I also read that the woman's position in that world was not very strong. So this is a little bit like a side note, but maybe you can tell a little bit about women in that society. So far we have talked about the men in that society, and would women have any access to sport at all? Did they do that at school?
Yeah, they have like something, but women's place was like totally different in that society. They were more like staying at home and doing home things. They were not involved in society, not in the decision made in the councils. My feeling is that they were a little bit like leave behind in all kind of things. They had like some kind of parties just for women, or and like really wise women or these courtesans. They could have like nice careers, but I think there were only like few of them. And when I'm writing in that time, of course, I would like to show them in better light or better picture. But you cannot do it, otherwise you're breaking the time or writing kind of like wrong. It would be historically wrong to write it. So you can just put these things between the lines and Alekko's questions that if this is the right way to do. So you really don't, you can't read that much about women. They don't basically exist in the texts. Yeah, that's a place for women in ancient Greece.
And for them to be omitted from the texts also shows that they didn't play this kind of role in society, that they would get heard and they would get remembered because they are absent from the texts.
Yeah, for example, I remember one text that even Socrates, who is said to be maybe the wisest man in the world, he said something like this, that do you know anyone who you spend less time than with your wife? So that tells us something about the role of the woman.
And yeah, that would be, completely different from in our world. If you think of the relationships, like marriage would be a very close relationship and all that. So of course it's like a different world, and it must have been quite a journey for you to learn all these things about that kind of the way we live is just one historical time and certain culture, but things have been like very different back then.
Yeah, and they are changing all the time, and our values and thoughts, how we should live, they are also changing. So I feel that we are not living in the best possible world. We are just living in some kind of world, and we just need to adapt and to try to figure it out how we can live in each time.
Yeah, I would be very curious about when we started out. You said that you were thinking about doing like two parallel stories. One would be from our time and our society and our sports, and the other one would be the story that is now that has come out in your book. So perhaps we can just spend a little time exploring, like, what are those kind of most interesting similarities, but also differences between these two different worlds.
Okay, when Alekos was actively in sport, the direction of sport it changed like dramatically, and they went more to individual direction. And I think it's the same what we have done now in our whole society during the last centuries, and it happened in all the fields in Athens. Like even though many wise men say that the harmonic body type should be the ideal, meaning that the people or the athletes still do all kind of disciplines, and they would compete in Spentathon, which was like the biggest and the most famous discipline in early times. But it all changed. The people wanted to do more like individual disciplines, like stadium run, which was 190 meters long, sprint distance, then like wrestling, boxing, horse racing, and that kind of things.
So athletes started specializing, so they became experts in just one sport.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And it same happened. What's like very funny, but it same happened in society. Like these old gods were about to lose their mighty powers, and then, for example, in sculpturing, they tried to imitate movement as it happened in action. And armies were that they hired more mercenaries instead of men from the city-states. Young kids were said to be lazy, blah blah blah. So like many things happened at the same time that went to or led to this individual direction. And like other similarities with money things, they were cheating in competitions. They were like they were fixing the results or bribing.
So sport becomes more corrupted.
Yes, corrupted, and or I'm not sure even more corrupted. I think the cheating and it has been always there in our societies in all the levels, but it also happened in ancient times. And then they sculptured statues in Olympia to remember athletes that you shouldn't cheat and you should achieve this success with your own speed, with your own powers, and with your own abilities, not by cheating. So I would say the core of the sport was exactly the same. But then again, what is like difference? I think it's what media has done to our world, and also like technology. But I wouldn't bring this technology in this discussion. I would just like say what like media is doing. It's like spreading like super fast all kind of things, and disciplines they develop or even die much faster. And I think in somehow it's not even that pure anymore, the sports. It's like so many like sponsors and media impact and things around us. So I think that's the biggest difference, and also something which I don't like that much in sports, even though it's there and we need to live with that. But that's the biggest difference that I can find.
I guess if we talk about today's sport, like if you don't get the interest from the media and from people, then there is also no funding for sport. So you also depend on that, even like whether you want or not.
Yeah, of course. And of course, there are like things like techniques of different kind of sport is changing. For example, in long jump, they used weights in their hands. All the athletes were competing naked in the field. Also, coaches were naked in Olympic Games. And this strong relationship between sport and religion that was like there, which we don't obviously have right now. And yeah,
maybe you can say a few words about the link between sport and religion. I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, like I said, Olympic Games were held in the beginning to honor Zeus, which was the highest god, and they had lots of stories about how these gods or Titans or half heroes, how they were competing back in history in the Olympic fields, and those stories they like grow and grow in the minds of regular people and burn the flame within for the kids, and I think that was like the main combining thing.
Yeah, would that? I mean, in our main character, does religion play a role in his life as well, and how he is doing sport?
For him, religion is not related to sports anymore. At that time, the role of religion, it was not that meaningful as it used to be. Like I said before, that the old gods of Greece, they lost a little bit their powers, even though people were sacrificing for them, but they were also like wondering if it's the right thing to do. And there were like few competing religions which were like continuously coming from the east, which being the birthplace for several different religions. Like there's also Judaism related to the book, and then the cult of Dionysus, and then of course the traditional 12 gods of Olympus. So I would say the religion, not related to sports, but related to society and Alekko's thinking. There's like lots of speculation about religion and what is the god and what's the right kind of religion, and is there some kind of evolution of religion, and yeah.
So I mean, I guess you cannot talk about the world as it was back then without talking about religions, because they were an important force shaping the society and people's understanding of life as well. And I mean, now that we are researching sport and religion and society, I mean, a lot of people who are doing research in this area would say that even if we are not in European countries, for example, that are kind of officially or moving away from religion, but it's still shaping a lot of the ways that we think about life and our values, and also a lot of our practices are shaped by religion, even if we are not aware of that ourselves.
Yes, I totally agree with you.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcast or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.